This video is going to delve into not only the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion in Ukraine, its origins, ideas, and current state, but also a history of Ukrainian nationalism and allegations made against Ukraine by Russia. If you would like a brief video on just the Azov Battalion, I would suggest, what is the Azov Battalion 5-minute history? That's not paid ad or anything like that. It's just something I found that's concise and easy to digest. Sources like Wikipedia are not the best for topics like this, as Ksenia Kaufman has proven in her work as described in the January 20th episode of Shitpost. This video is going to go much more in depth, and we'll find ourselves everywhere from Kiev and Rus medieval history to current events. But to set the table, our overview, first, we'll discuss an overview of topics, and that will include perspectives, and we'll spend some time on that. So those perspectives will include Russian perspectives, perspectives from the US, as well as perspectives that you might run into on the internet. We'll then look at the origins of Azov Battalion, and these topics can go as far back as we would want them to, but I'll do my best to be concise while also including all of the pertinent information. We'll round this out by discussing not only US involvement with Azov Battalion, but just in general Western involvement with Azov Battalion, and that can include funding as well as training. And then we'll wrap this up with some conclusions. I'm also going to do my best to not editorialize through this or offer opinions until that last piece in conclusions. I will kind of build a case for my perspective on what's happening, given all the content that we view. However, while viewing that content, I will attempt to hold any bias that I might have. The Azov Battalion is a nationalist paramilitary that's been incorporated into the Ukrainian armed military. The unit has neo-Nazi members. It formed in the Mariupol region of Ukraine in 2014. And we're looking at this map because before we delve into the actual battalion, we must first understand the region that's being discussed. The Azov Battalion being formed in this region of Mariupol, where that red arrow is, shows how close it is to breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. So the region that we're discussing is in the midst of ongoing battles. And we'll get into what Donetsk and Luhansk is and what these breakaway regions and republics mean. But for now, let's just say this. This is a theater of battle that's been ongoing since 2014. And this is also very close to the Russian border, as we see. We also see in this map that Mariupol is close to the Crimean Peninsula. Vice News created a documentary showing Ukrainian withdrawal from Crimea in 2014 that's worth a watch. Since that time, Russia has annexed the territory. Mariupol is also very close to the Russian border, as previously discussed. This is important to understand, as fighting in the region increased. So-called self-protection units were established by football ultras, which are basically something between a gang and a paramilitary. This environment, along with the opportunity to fight, especially against Russians, catered to a certain extremist audience. Something else I'd like to point out. We have the red box in the upper right, and this is showing breakaway republics where there's ongoing battles. We have Mariupol to the south of that, in that red star, and the Crimean Peninsula to the south. What you see in the center upper left by the word Ukraine is Kiev, and Kiev is, of course, the capital. It's in a green box if you're watching this video. So the point in this is to show just how far removed Mariupol is from the political center of Ukraine, where these decisions are being made. To show how far away, or perhaps how close to the Russian border these battles and annexed territories are compared to the capital, the center of Ukraine. The Russian narrative. So why is the Russian narrative important for us to understand? Well, we want to be informed and have context and historical background when viewing any claims. And Russia is, of course, a key player in the current Ukrainian conflict. I also believe that we will eventually find that Russia attempts to paint all Ukrainian nationalism, aside from a pseudo satellite state, as Nazism. So let's roll through these quickly for context. The first claim made by Putin is that NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has expanded since the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is true. Now, there's a lot that goes into the statement, the narrative, but just for now, let's just keep objective reality here. What we see on the screen are the founding members of NATO, and most of them are either Western European or North American. Now, if we scroll down to members who have joined post-dissolution of the Soviet Union, we see that most of these are Eastern European countries, and many of these countries were former Eastern Bloc countries or members of the Soviet Union. So has NATO expanded? Yes. And what does this have to do with Azov Battalion? Well, nothing directly. However, indirectly, speaking more broadly about Ukrainian nationalism, it is important to note that Ukraine did submit an application for membership in 2008, which has essentially been on hold since that date to join NATO. Ukraine is fascist. The existence of Azov Battalion greatly helps Russian propaganda in this regard. It's very easy to take an image of some Azov Battalion member holding a swastika and use it to generalize all Ukrainian nationalism. However, the Azov Battalion is but one small part of the larger Ukrainian military that actually gained legitimacy from fighting Russian-backed separatists. Not all members of Azov are fascists. Not all Ukrainian military is Azov. And the current Ukrainian president is Jewish. However, Azov's existence allows for Russia to make ties to events that occurred as far back as World War II regarding some Ukrainian nationalist collaboration with Nazi forces in the hope for independence from the Soviet Union, with events that occurred in EuroMaidan protests and ultimately the current Ukrainian nationalists. This deep historical and cultural ties are embedded in the claim and might be missed by people in the West. Genocide against Russians. Words matter, especially for propaganda purposes, and Putin uses this word with intent. The genocide claim directly references the Jewish Holocaust in World War II, and so again, draws the discussion regarding Ukrainian nationalism and independence to that era in order to cloud all discussions with this idea of Nazism. It can also be seen as a slight against Ukraine, who has officially recognized the Holodomor, or Ukrainian famine, which we'll discuss. It is a slight because it's very obvious that there is no genocide occurring against ethnic Russians, and that the somewhat ridiculousness of the claim acts to belittle the very real Ukrainian suffering in the 1930s. What Putin is describing is actually battles in breakaway republics between mostly ethnic Russian separatists and mostly ethnic Ukrainian military. Now, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has documented human rights abuses ranging from freedom of movement to torture from both Russian separatist groups and Ukrainian military, including the Azov Battalion. Reports such as this one are public facing, and so anybody can go on to the United Nations Human Rights website and pull them up. This is simply the latest update on the human rights situation in Ukraine. If we scroll down here, we can see in this paragraph, the conflict zone saw an increase in civilian casualties and forcible recruitment of adult men by armed groups, restrictions on the crossing of the contact line by armed groups, including tougher restrictions by the Luhansk People's Republic, were disproportionate and affected the rights to family life, social security, employment, and healthcare. Viewing this paragraph, we see while police successfully protected assemblies organized by lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and intersex organizations, they failed to respond adequately to protests and hate speech inciting violence against Roma peoples. Further into this report, we see freedom of opinion and expression, that the HRMMU documented 4 attacks targeting media workers. I call this out because they were conducted by the National Corps, and we will come back to this organization later, but it's essentially a political incarnation of Patriots of Ukraine, which has ties to the Azov Battalion. And still further, in this paragraph, we see the Russian Federation occupation authorities in Crimea continue to restrict fundamental freedoms and civic space, in particular, freedom of peaceful assembly, through the use of exceptional emergency measures related to COVID-19. And so the point of this is to show that no, there is not a genocide program necessarily occurring in these eastern breakaway regions of Ukraine. However, that does not mean that there aren't bad things happening in those areas from all sides, all actors included in those battles. Ukraine is not a country. Ukraine is certainly a country, regardless of what some might claim. However, such a degrading remark is again targeting the concept of Ukrainian nationalism. It is a claim made to build a framework of discussion in such a way as to say that there are Ukrainians who are Russian or friendly with Russia, and there are Nazis. The US narrative is far less complex. It consists mostly of Russia being the clear aggressor, Ukraine being a sovereign state, and that claims of denazifying Ukraine are propaganda or excuses for invasion. However, there are some things that are left out of the US narrative, such as the expansion of NATO. But more pertinent to this video, the idea that the United States, as well as Canada, assisted in training Ukrainian military members back in 2014 and 2015, and these included members of the Azov Battalion. So that means that the United States, as well as Canada, engaged in training militarily Nazis in Ukraine. This is also true for funding, as the United States sent funds to Ukraine to assist with their military. These funds indirectly got funneled to the Azov Battalion as the Azov Battalion was rolled into, absorbed, and incorporated into the Ukrainian military. In terms of internet narratives surrounding the Azov Battalion or just the broader current Ukraine conflict, know that people have agendas, and it might be obvious what these agendas are within the guardrails of mainstream politics, but you'll find people, say on the left, co-opting current events or reiterating Russian propaganda, either out of old Soviet sympathies, pro-communist takes, or an idea that anything anti-West is good. You also have people that are trying to make a good faith effort to understand Russia or an opposing force as well. More than anything, just know that there are various angles to this discussion and that not everyone is speaking in genuine good faith. So all of that aside, conservatives haven't said much, to be honest. CPAC just happened. The messaging has been a little bit everywhere, but most of it has been focusing on domestic issues, trying to attack President Joe Biden. Far-right Republicans are much more dubious, maybe like Trump people or people even to the right of Trump. This crowd tends to be much more favorable towards Russia. However, discussions about far-right neo-Nazis in Ukraine aren't necessarily hot topics with them. Now, with Democrats, of course, we see the opposite. We see greater hostility towards Russia, towards Putin, and a lot of this is based in what happened in 2016 with misinformation efforts during that election. And then on the left, this is where you have, I think, the much more interesting divergent set of narratives than really anywhere else. And that's because people are attempting to either empathize with or understand at least perhaps where Russia is coming from, try to equally apply a negative critique maybe to the US or NATO as they view other people doing to Russia, as well as some ideological battles occurring too, that can just range from believing that you're promoting something that's, I don't know, anti-exploitative or anti-imperialist, all the way down to advocating or engaging in discussions involving what happened in World War II between certain battalions. So the internet narratives exist. Know that they exist. However, take them with a grain of salt. This was more so that if you see something, you encounter somebody making a certain claim or coming at you from a certain angle, that you have some context to place that into. Origins of not only the Azov Battalion, but also concepts and ideas related to Ukrainian nationalism. Please, I encourage you to learn more about the history of Ukraine and surrounding area if you're interested. Use your .edu sites when you conduct searches on search engines to find the best material. I very much enjoyed this region and various times in history in college as an undergrad history student myself. However, for this video, we will not go too far back or stay there too long, at least. My point in discussing Ukrainian people and history is, one, to validate their existence and to validate that, yes, they exist separate from, connected, but separate from Russia. True. At one time in the medieval period, there was a civilization, Kievan Rus, that were a confederation of Slavic peoples. However, tracing the developments of Kiev versus Moscow is a good place to start in understanding the divergence of Ukrainian people, language, culture, religion from Russia. The one thing I'd also like to point out is that there's been a very long struggle of Ukrainians for a secure and independent Ukraine. This desire predates the existence of modern nation states and can be traced back to trade routes during the Byzantine Empire, or Huns using the steppe region for entrance into Europe. In other words, Ukraine's unique geography and location have contributed to historical, political, and border insecurity. Leading up to World War I, most of modern Ukraine was under control of the Russian Empire. Ukrainian nationalists looked to Central European powers such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany to liberate them from Russian rule. Ukrainian nationalists met and voted to support Central powers if war did indeed break out. I found, along with .edu sites, the YouTube channel History Hustle. Very useful for this topic. Is run by a historian who goes far more in depth than I will here. It's insightful that the Ukraine looked to Central Europe for separation from Russia, because it will do this again in World War II and later, considering entrance into the European Union and NATO membership. The Ukrainian People's Republic was declared in 18 as a free and independent Ukrainian state at the end of World War I, but it was short-lived. Instead, the territory was carved up again by surrounding powers, such as Poland, but most notably, the now Soviet Russia. Much of the current narrative is based in this idea of fascism and communism, especially when you are speaking to people on the internet. And so we're now into that phase in history. It is under Soviet Russia, specifically Joseph Stalin in the early 1930s, that Ukraine suffered the Holodomor. This was a famine byproduct of Soviet planning. Ukrainians and many Western historians point to this as punishment for Ukraine to grind out any nationalist hopes. It was genocide. While Russian historians view it as an unfortunate side effect, but not as something planned, such as genocide. Russian historians will also debate the amount of deaths. Regardless, many people suffered and died, which only served to strengthen nationalist resolve and vilify not only Russia, but the concept of communism. And this leads us to an important part of Ukrainian history, at least for Russian and far-right Ukrainian propaganda purposes. Part of Ukraine fell under Poland at the completion of World War I. When Poland in turn fell to Nazi Germany in the beginning of World War II, so did these western parts of Ukraine. Some Ukrainian nationalists were, again, hopeful that a Central European power would unite and liberate Ukraine. Stefan Bandera was the leader of a far-right Ukrainian nationalist group at the time. He provided a speech in support of Nazi Germany. The hope, again, was that it would include a free Ukraine from Soviet rule. However, the Nazis did not listen, and instead Bandera was sent to a concentration camp. It was clear that Nazis had no interest in a free or independent Ukraine. Still, it is true that Ukrainian nationalists not only collaborated with Nazis under the force of coercion or threats, but some willingly. It is also true that many more Ukrainians did not collaborate. And overall, more Ukrainians actually fought with the Red Army of the Soviet Union than with Nazi Germany. However, there were still Ukrainian nationalists that did collaborate with Nazi Germany. And we'll take a look at some of the specific groups or battalions that they consisted of. These Ukrainian Nazi collaborative groups ranged in purpose and goal from auxiliary police to official battalions within the Nazi German military. Some of the more prominent of these entities included the Ukrainian Schutzmannschaft, the Nightingale Battalion, the Roland Battalion, the Freiwilligen Stamm Regiments, the Ostseeglugen, the Heve, and SS Division Galicia. Overall, losses in Ukraine during World War II were substantial. It is this time period that groups such as the Azov Battalion look to for anti-communist, anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian nationalist inspiration. So if you're wondering, why in the heck is a Ukrainian person flying some offshoot of Nazi propaganda in 2022? Well, now we know. Again, it's very important to reiterate, not all Ukrainians collaborated with Nazis in World War II. Not all Ukrainian nationalists collaborated with Nazis in World War II. Not all Ukrainians who collaborated with Nazis did so freely. Sometimes this is under coercion or threats. And many more Ukrainians actually fought with the Russian side against Nazi military in Ukraine during World War II. With the end of World War II, Ukraine remained under Soviet rule until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. After Ukraine finally gained independence via the Belovich Accords, the country began its journey of self-governance. However, it took only a handful of election cycles for accusations of corruption and Russian involvement to appear. One particular case of this led to what was called the Orange Revolution. I personally remember these events and discussing them with Ukrainian Americans. Out of this protest emerged Ukraine's first pro-European president, Viktor Yushchenko. Yushchenko governed over multiple dissolutions of parliament and an assassination attempt by poison, which left him permanently disfigured. During this time of political instability, far-right nationalist groups had formed to greater and lesser degrees. Some of these organizations laid the groundwork for what would become the Azov Battalion. One of the more significant early organizations was Patriots of Ukraine. It is important due to its ties to the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine, in other words, a political party. It's also significant because Andriy Biletsky was a member of Patriots of Ukraine and would go on to lead the Azov Battalion. Svoboda is essentially the rebranding of Social Nationalist Party. In this rebranding, ties to Patriots of Ukraine were officially broken. However, Patriots of Ukraine reformed in 2005. Svoboda had mild election success in mostly regional or local elections. In 2008 and 2009, around the time that Russia invaded Georgia. Since then, Svoboda has failed to win enough votes to gain seats in the national parliament. The right sector was a coalition of far-right groups in Ukraine that came together during the EuroMaidan protests. More on that to come. But Svoboda, the National Corps, which was the Patriots of Ukraine rebranded, among other groups, all came together in 2019. Svoboda is essentially the rebranding of Social National Party. And in this rebranding, ties to Patriots of Ukraine were officially broken. However, Patriots of Ukraine reformed in 2005. In that reformation of Patriots of Ukraine, a political organization was also created called National Corps. Svoboda had mild election success in mostly regional or local elections around 2008, 2009. That was during the time where Russia invaded Georgia. Since then, Svoboda has failed to win enough votes to gain any national parliamentary seats. Right sector is a coalition of far-right groups in Ukraine that came together during the EuroMaidan protests. More on those to come. Svoboda, the National Corps, among other groups, all came together in 2019 in a joint effort to win parliamentary seats in Ukraine. However, even in this united front, their election results were so poor that they won no national seats in parliaments. This source was useful in describing characteristics and actions of the Svoboda party, as well as right sector in Ukraine. However, that being said, I do want to call out the clear bias in this. It comes from CIS/EMO.net, which is a Russian website, and you can clearly see that this is pro-Russian. However, I believe that the pieces in this, such as manifestos, for instance, are still useful to look at for context. It's easy to call people neo-Nazis, but to get more specific into what were Patriots of Ukraine talking about? What was the Social National Assembly talking about? Well, here on page 108 of this document states, the Social National Assembly Patriots of Ukraine Manifesto recognizes the nation state of Ukrainian nation. What they see as a problem is that in order to develop fully, Ukraine must become a superpower. The manifesto says the ultimate goal of Ukraine's foreign policy is world domination. And so in this manifesto, like we see with many ethnic mythologies tied up in racist ideology or thought, there's this type of Ukrainian imperialism found within the manifesto of SNA. The motto runs, sociality, racism, great power. And it makes references back to Kievan Rus that we discussed at the top of this video. The idea being that there can only be one power in this region, and that power should be Kiev. From here, we get into the specific racism and supremacy, but it's not just white supremacy. It's this idea of an ethnic Ukrainian supremacy. And so in this paragraph, what we have here is describing who these ethnic Ukrainians are that are superior. And at the bottom, it states representatives of other races who happen to be in Ukraine must be deported to their motherland as soon as possible. Going down further, this document also discusses Andriy Biletsky, who we discussed, who was in Patriots of Ukraine, would later go on to lead the Azov Battalion. So here within the context of SNAPU leadership, it says Andriy Biletsky, who has recently been released by the amnesty announced by the victorious EuroMaidan, dwells on the issue in his language or race article in the section called the Leaders column on the Patriots of Ukraine website. According to Biletsky, it is the racial type that fully shapes a cultural face of a nation. It goes on to state that Ukrainian nationalists must struggle above all for conserving racial purity of the Ukrainian nation. And the appendix of this document shows a manifesto of the Social National Assembly, Patriots of Ukraine. Just the opening section. The organization advocates a monoracial society based on the principles of Ukrainian national greatness and social justice. So very much at the outset, it says that it's one race, right? This Ukrainian nationalism. Now, the rest of this document I did not find as useful. It gets into the EuroMaidan protests, and it's extremely biased. We'll put it that way. So it isn't that it's not useful. However, if you are going to look this up on your own, understand that this is coming from a Russian perspective. It's just when we're talking about the manifesto of the Social National Assembly, this is objective. And there are not many ways that you can misinterpret direct quotes or documents. Like what we saw with the Orange Revolution, which was a revolution that did put in place a pro-EU, pro-European leader, we also saw this occur a few years later with the Revolution of Dignity. Now, leading up to the Revolution of Dignity were the EuroMaidan protests, and we're going to get into that right now. But those protests led to the Revolution of Dignity that resulted in a new government, which was pro-EU, pro-Europe. And that in turn resulted in the breakaway republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. And so what led to the EuroMaidan protest? Well, first, they were called this because it was Euro, pro-European, and then Maidan because it occurred in Maidan Square. And the heart of these protests were really a series of grievances against President Yanukovych. Yanukovych had been seen as being very pro-Russian, or perhaps even under the thumb of Russia. He was seen as somewhat of a strong man, but what really set protesters off, what really created this event, was his reversal of signing a trade agreement with European Union. Instead, he decided to take a bailout from Russia. And this trade agreement would have benefited Ukraine much more than this bailout from Russia. However, it wasn't just about the bare bones of pros and cons in that decision. It was, again, seen as this person not serving the interests of Ukraine, but instead being a puppet or a proxy to Russia. And so this is an article from BBC, and I like it because it's of the era. This is April 2014. Profile: Ukraine's ultranationalist right sector. It reads, the right sector is the most radical wing of Ukraine's Maidan protest movement that toppled President Viktor Yanukovych in February. Originally set up as an alliance of ultranationalist groups in November 2013, the right sector is now a party with a leader, although it does state that poll ratings are negligible. Critics say that the party's inflammatory rhetoric and violence is helping Russian media to depict Ukraine as overrun with neo-Nazis, who threatened the Russian-speaking population. So this was acknowledged in 2014, this propaganda. Protest role. Activists claiming to be right sector members were involved in Kiev's Maidan protests from late November, but the group did not attract much attention until violent clashes with police in central Kiev on January 19th, in which it played a leading role. So we're going to get into that role and maybe some estimates about numbers of who might have been at these protests for right sector. And recall that right sector is kind of like an umbrella organization for many other smaller fringe groups. And that having been said, before we go further, I just do want to pause and call out that the right sector being a coalition of many different groups, culminating in a party with a leader, Dmytro Yurish. Even with that united front, the polling was still negligible. I found this article from Journal of Labor and Society, published in 2020, useful, entitled "The Far Right, the EuroMaidan and Maidan Massacre in Ukraine." And so if you're watching the video, I have the abstract up. I won't read it all, but the summary for the abstract is essentially that there was bias everywhere in reporting, whether it be from news media, Russia, or Western sources. And the type of bias depends on where the information was coming from. It goes on to state that the right sector and other far right groups were present. However, numerically, they were negligible, very small when compared to the amount of overall protesters at the EuroMaidan protest. That having been said, the minority of this far right sector, the right sector, numerically was very much outweighed by its actions. And what occurred in general with these protests were that they initially started peacefully and then devolved into violence. And what this article essentially lays out, or the narrative that this article lays out, is that it was the violence that led to the overthrow of governments, not just the general protest grievances. And if we agree upon that if there had been no violence at these protests, perhaps the government would not have been overthrown. But if we agree upon that, then we also have to agree upon the fact that even though numerically insignificant, the right sector, as well as other actors, played a very significant role in the actions and events that unfolded. And so in the section that focuses on the EuroMaidan protests, it lays out some of the players, not only right sector, but also the Svoboda political group that we talked about. And this is nice because in this paragraph, it breaks down its history, starting out as the Social National Party of Ukraine and then rebranding. And as we discussed, it was within that rebranding that Svoboda kind of attempted to be a legitimate political organization and cut ties with Patriots of Ukraine. And then out of that, Patriots of Ukraine reforming and creating a new political party, the National Corps. What I find interesting is in this section that says Svoboda reported that between 2,000 and 5,000 out of some 15,000 party members during this time were present at the protests. And if we scroll down, it goes on to talk about right sector being formed by smaller far-right political organizations and groups of football ultras. In the early stages of the protest, it names some other ones that we haven't mentioned, White Hammer, for instance, but that there were a few hundred consisting of from the right sector. And so this goes on to talk about overall numbers at this protest. And It claims that there were somewhere around 80,000 to 120,000 people calculated by a Google Earth estimate. So members of Svoboda and right sector numbered, if those are correct, and then we look at the numbers presented here, that essentially all of these far right elements consisted of somewhere between 5% to 7.5, maybe 8% of the total participants. So regardless, under 10% of the total protesters were associated with these far right groups, and it could potentially even be half of that. And so there's no reason to believe that there were more of a contingency from these far right groups, or that there were less people, especially as that was calculated using Google Earth. But what I cannot confirm, and what I'm not going to go into here, is whether or not the idea that the presence of these far right groups is why things escalated and why ultimately there is violence, and that the conclusion of that violence was an overthrow of the government. Those are leaps that I'm not going to make. And so this is useful because it confirms and validates some of the history of these groups and organizations that we're looking at. But it's also interesting that the number of far right participants was so small, perhaps 5% of the very large, up to 120,000 people protest that was occurring. What I'm not going to do, however, is bridge the gaps in narrative that this article does, claiming that the presence of this far right contingency, no matter how small, was outweighed by their actions, claiming that it was their actions that escalated violence leading to death, and then those events kind of being why the government was overthrown. That's a lot of high stepping to get from chasm to chasm in that narrative. And so again, using a BBC news article, Ukraine Profile Timeline from 2020, we can see the Maidan revolution beginning in November of 2013. Tens of thousands of protesters take to the streets to protest at the government's sudden decision to abandon plans to sign an association agreement with the EU, blaming Russian pressure. And this is nice here because it gives us, again, a timeline. This is not directly related to Azov, but these events are. So all in 2014, February, March, April, May, July. In February, security forces kill at least 77 protesters in Kiev. The president flees to Russia and opposition takes over. And that's where we kind of ended at with that previous article. The previous article kind of was describing what led up to this point, but now we have the president fleeing Ukraine, seeking asylum in Russia. In March, Russian forces annex Crimea. In April, pro-Russian armed groups seize parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. In May, Petro Poroshenko wins a presidential election on a pro-Western platform in Ukraine. And then in July, pro-Russian forces shoot down the Malaysian airliner over Eastern Ukraine conflict zone, killing 298 people. So this is just nice because it very quickly gets us through a series of events. So we go from kind of that phase of proto Azov and learning about the Social National Assembly, Patriots of Ukraine, their breakup and reforming in different iterations, how they came together under right sector to engage in the Maidan protests, which again were against a unpopular president that was seen as being not only perhaps pro-Moscow, but under the thumb of Moscow. With that previous article, then ending showing that while insignificant numerically, the impact of the far-right contingency might have been very significant. After this, the president flees, and we have a series of events that leads to a new president that's pro-West or pro-EU, pro-Europe, as well as the breakaway republics that occur. So we talked about those at the top when we were looking at the map of Mariupol, where Azov Battalion forms. So these breakaway republics are very close to the home of where Azov is going to originate or come from. And then we also see here too, the use of the term pro-Russian, because this is when Russia really gets involved on the ground, 2014. Initially, Putin said there are no Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And then shortly after that, he said, okay, there are, but they're not fighting. They're only engaged in training. This is also going to be around the time that the US and Canada began to get involved, perhaps a little bit later, 2014, 2015, in which amongst training other Ukrainian military service members, they train members of the Azov Battalion, or potentially do at least. The Brookings Institute published an article, Order from Chaos, Ukraine, 6 years after the Maidan protests. And so this is February 21, 2020. And this is an interesting article because one, it sets up issues or obstacles that the then new president or incoming administration is going to have to face, President Zelensky, who is now in power. But it also goes through that timeline of what happened with the Maidan revolution, the president fleeing Ukraine, going to Russia, and then this period in time where there is an interim government. I should mention also that a pro-Russian argument at this time would say that this was an illegal coup and that this interim government was a puppet government for the West. That was kind of the narrative coming out from the Russian side of things. But of course, people on the right supported this because it was moving away from what was perceived to be, Russian meddling or oversight to sovereignty independence. But this is the part that I want to discuss here: war with Russia. Within days after this revolution of dignity, which is called, Ukraine found itself at war with Russia, and Russian soldiers with insignias removed from their combat fatigues seized Crimea. I mentioned this at the top. Vice has a great documentary on it. If you just search Vice Crimea, I'm sure that it'll pop up. But they have an embedded journalist that is actually with Ukrainian soldiers that are leaving the Crimean Peninsula. It goes on to say President Vladimir Putin at first claimed that these little green men, as they were called, because they had no flag or identity on their uniforms, belonged to a local defense militia, but weeks later admitted that they were Russian soldiers, and they were actually given awards for this behavior. The article also goes on to talk about how shortly after the annexation of Crimea, these little green men, Russian soldiers without any insignia, began occupying administrative buildings in key cities and territories in eastern Ukraine. And so these are going to become those breakaway republics. And if you recall from the beginning of this, when we looked at Mariupol, these were the regions to the north, and then Crimea to the south. So this is nice because it brings us into more of a current state where within this reality, within the reality of these little green men, Russian soldiers without insignias, beginning to invade Ukraine, annexing pieces in Crimea, this is where these, whatever you would like to call them, paramilitary, self-defense associations, I mean, these are kind of, far right street gangs that are affiliated, some of them through friendship or membership in football ultra organizations. This is where they get their start in fighting these people in this group. So kind of fast forward to the end, one of the takeaways is going to be that, in many ways, Russia benefits from the existence of Azov Brigade because it helps some of the propaganda. But without Russia having done this, the Azov Brigade would probably have remained paramilitaries at best, maybe closer to street gangs or ultras. It was the little green men crossing that border into Ukraine, and then later the success of what would become Azov Battalion that really fueled the creation of the battalion and enabled them to be rolled into the Ukrainian military. And so we've talked about the EuroMaidan protests and how the right sector was included in that, how they manifested in the Revolution of Dignity, which was essentially an overthrow of the government with a pro-European president then winning the subsequent election, as well as how these breakaway republics really formed. Now, of course, there were people within Ukraine that were part of paramilitaries, but the little green men coming in and supporting them, as well as annexing Crimea, is really what brings us to the next stage. And the next stage is Azov being formed in 2014. And so I have here battles against separatists as well as Ukraine National Guard, because we need to understand how it is that this group became a member of the official military in Ukraine. And so this is an article. It's a little choppy because it's translated, but it's from 2014. So at least the same year when all this is happening. It's the summer, and it's titled "Commander of the Azov Battalion: The Most Terrible Mistake of the Authorities is Political Negotiations with Separatists." This article is, first of all, kind of documenting that Andriy Biletsky is the commander of the Azov Battalion. And in the beginning, it talks a little bit about his role in the Maidan protests and how he's kind of, he hasn't been a big thing on the national scene yet. It goes on to say 4 months ago, he, Biletsky, was imprisoned in Kharkiv pre-trial detention center on charges of extremism and attempted murder. And now he is fighting against separatists in the Donetsk region. So we might say, well, how did that happen? At the conclusion of the Maidan protests going into the Revolution of Dignity, there was a general amnesty given for political prisoners in Ukraine. So well-intentioned, right? People that might have been extrajudiciously arrested during those protests by a pro-Russian government. However, there were also people that were imprisoned for other reasons, such as Biletsky here, who again was in pre-trial detention for charges of extremism and attempted murder. It goes on to say that he is 34 years old, that he was a former historian that headed the radical ultra-nationalist organization Patriots of Ukraine. And so this kind of connects everything to the Azov Brigade, everything that we've talked about with the role of Patriots Ukraine, the right sector, National Corps arising from Patriots of Ukraine when they kind of regathered. And so this kind of brings everything together for us. We talked about Patriots of Ukraine. We talked about their role, first with various political parties and then kind of reforming and constituting their own. We talked about the right sector and their role with the EuroMaidan protests. Now we're after those are complete, and the former member of Patriots of Ukraine, Biletsky, here has been freed from prison due to this general amnesty after Revolution of Dignity. And he has traveled to those breakaway republics that we just mentioned, where those little green men were assisting with separatist paramilitaries to lead the fight against them. And the group for which he is leading the fight with is the Azov Battalion. In the article's interview, Biletsky says, "It all began when, after the victory of the Maidan, political prisoners began to be released. They also let me out. The day after the shooting of people on the protest, the Maidan, I was released from prison. Biletsky goes on to say, when he left the pretrial detention center, he was met by friends, activists from right-wing organizations, football ultras, former members of Patriots of Ukraine and other right-wing organizations. And essentially that the first thing that they did when he was out was go fight. He goes on to say, when talking about the formation of the Azov Battalion, when the backbone was already developed, we entered the stage of armed conflict. At first, as you remember, it flared up with small seizures, holding buildings, hostages, etc. And there was a desire to respond in the same way, that is, by capturing terrorists, preventing their actions. Our group eventually became the backbone of the Azov Battalion. And so this is the formation of the battalion, where it came from. We're there now. And this is an interesting article. It's from 2016, and it's how to join a Ukrainian militia. If we scroll down, it goes on to describe essentially what happened. So we need to know that too. So what happened? The Ukrainian army was so pitiful when fighting broke out in the Donbass, which are those breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine, in April 2014, that President Petro Poroshenko had to outsource the nation's defense to volunteers. Some of that's true. I think that there is also concern over whether soldiers wanted to fight other Ukrainians as well. But by July, approximately 15,000 citizens and foreigners had joined these volunteer battalions. It goes on to describe that there are territorial units, as well as other types of units. There's many different ideologies. So for instance, this article describes that there were veterans from the Chechen War against Russia, as well as Aryan nationalists, including members of the Azov Battalion. So in other words, ideology didn't matter. It was, are you willing to fight against Russians in this region? Something that's interesting too, it states, most members I met were foreigners who had joined because Azov, allegedly funded by a steel tycoon, paid $500 per month. And we'll get to this a little bit later too, but it's inaccurate to claim that all members of the Azov Battalion are neo-Nazi. Now, that having been said, I don't want to misrepresent Azov as being paid mercenaries. We know that not to be true by kind of deciphering and untangling its origins, of course. This article is from 2015, and it describes the scene of Mariupol base of the Azov Battalion. It goes on to state that the first thing you notice as you walk through the corridors of the Azov Battalion's base in Mariupol are the swastikas. There are many, painted on doors, adorning the walls, and chalked onto blackboards of this former school, now temporary headquarters for the Azov troops. This is an interesting article if you're watching the video, because there are pictures and it's from the time. It goes on to interview members of the Azov Battalion, most of which you deny being neo-Nazis. However, they're coy about it, and their beliefs are still aligned with things that we saw, for instance, in that manifesto. So it isn't as if they aren't racist or they aren't supremacists. They're just kind of playing coy, to be honest. The main usefulness, I think, of this article is to read, of course, and see what the people are saying about why they joined. Take it with a grain of salt, but also to see the images too, because this is the battalion at its very early origin, in its home base in Mariupol. But I'm showing it again to kind of just say, yes, these are neo-Nazis, even if not everybody in the group is. The first thing that you see when you walk through their headquarters are swastikas. However, the question still remains, how do you get from a group of ultras or football fans, gangs, paramilitaries? How do you leap from that to being members of the Ukraine's National Guard, getting training from the United States and Canada, as well as funding? So this article does a good, concise job of explaining what happened. It's titled "Azov Regiment to Join Ukraine's National Guard," and it's from October of 2014. It states that the Azov Special Purposes Regiment under the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine will be integrated into the National Guard of Ukraine. It goes on to say that the Azov Battalion was recognized for its success in fighting separatists and pro-Russian forces in the breakaway regions, and states that there are currently 800 soldiers in the regiment. As previously reported, and I think that this is a very important part to it, the Ministry of Defense has begun the process of transferring all interested soldiers from the volunteer battalions who are currently under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Internal Affairs to the armed forces of Ukraine. There's another article that I was reading as well that is as late as 2019 that this process had been ongoing for, so a few years. But this is significant because it's not just pointing out the Azov Battalion. Yes, they were very successful and they were an early transfer into the armed forces of Ukraine. However, the Ministry of Defense began transferring all or any interested soldiers from volunteer battalions into the armed forces of Ukraine so that they could receive training. Additionally, on October 2nd, it was announced that there were plans to create a single special law enforcement unit composed of MIA's volunteer battalions and other special units currently operating in the MIA would cease operation. In other words, what's happening here is that initially Ukraine just needed people to fight. And so you had everybody from, ultras, football fans, to Chechen rebels, right? Veterans in these breakaway regions fighting against separatists and unmarked Russian forces. You see in that documentary of Russia taking Crimea, it was essentially bloodless. They just rolled in and took it. So Ukraine was on its heels and they brought in anybody who would fight. This is 2016. And so maybe a year and a half, 2 years into the conflict, what we see is the Ministry of Defense for Ukraine now trying to rein in these forces and say, okay, you've done well. Now come back and we're going to train you and we're going to put you into the armed services with better equipment, but also potentially with some oversight too. It's in this transition where we say the Ministry of Defense has begun the process of transferring all interested soldiers from volunteer battalions into the armed forces of Ukraine. It's in this time period that the United States and Canada is helping with training, because these are the people that they're training. And so some of these people are people from the Azov Battalion, and some of those people of the Azov Battalion are neo-Nazis or racists. So part of this process of bringing in all of these groups into the formal military ranks, part of this led to Biletsky separating himself from the Azov Battalion. And this is how he got into politics with the National Corps, which was the political wing of kind of that reformed Patriots of Ukraine group. And so this essentially brings us to today with the Azov Battalion. But there's one more thing that we need to discuss before we get to the end here and talk about some potential conclusions or summaries. And that's to delve a little bit more into US involvement with this. On this slide, I have the 2016 Consolidated Appropriations Act. This was money being sent to Ukraine to fund the Ukrainian military. And then we also have 22 US Code 2378D, limitation on assistance to security forces. This was used in an effort by Democrats to block the Azov Battalion from receiving military aid from the United States. So this is from EuroMaidan Press News and Views from Ukraine. Is the Azov Battalion a terrorist organization, as 40 US House Democrats claim? And this is from 2019. In a notable letter signed by 40 USA House Democrats and addressed to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, they asked why certain white supremacist groups, including the Ukrainian Azov Battalion, were not included on the foreign terrorist organization list. It goes on to say Representative Max Rose, who's a Democrat, shared the letter of 40 congressmen to Mike Pompeo on Twitter with the following comment, quote, violent white supremacist groups meet all of the State Department criteria for inclusion on the list of foreign terrorist organizations. But for some reason, they refuse to label these groups as terrorists that they are, hampering law enforcement's ability to keep us safe. And for context, this was also around the time period of the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. And this tweet is archived, still available on Twitter with all the signatures of the Democrats. Democrats would also try to prevent funds from reaching the Azov Battalion using a US code limitation on assistance to security forces. Section A, in general, no assistance shall be furnished under the chapter or the Arms Export Control Act to any unit of security forces of any foreign country if the Secretary of State has credible information that such unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. All that having been said, funds did continue to go to Ukrainian military with no restrictions. And the US and Canada did indeed train these former volunteer groups that did compose the Azov Battalion, some of whom are racist neo-Nazis. And so did the infamous Azov Battalion inspire Putin's denazification claim? This was a question posed by the Jerusalem Post. It goes on to say, Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly listed the denazification of Ukraine as one of his motives for invading the country. And while Ukraine, along with many other European countries, has far-right political parties and neo-Nazi organizations, the fact that since its turn to the West in 2014, there have been prominent Jews in the Ukrainian government, and its current president is Jewish, which makes the claim seem ludicrous. In June 2015, the US Congress passed a resolution intended to block American military funding for Ukraine from being used to provide training or weaponry to the battalion, with one congressman calling it a neo-Nazi paramilitary militia. However, this ban was lifted in 2016. Since its incorporation into Ukraine's official armed forces, it has moved away from neo-Nazism, and a Ukrainian Jewish group as early as 2016 did not oppose lifting the US ban. Here's another article by a Jewish publication, Haaretz, called Ukrainian Jews Angry and Appalled at Putin's denazification claim. And, this can kind of bring us full circle, I believe. This states that President Vladimir Putin stated in an address to the Russian people on Thursday morning that the purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime. To this end, we will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Shortly after the speech, the Ukrainian government official Twitter account posted a depiction of Adolf Hitler proudly caressing the face of Putin. And it wrote, "This is not a meme, but our and your reality right now." This article goes on to interview Ukrainian Jewish people. One person that's interviewed had a succinct response to Russian claims, calling Putin totally nuts. He said, quote, "The Jews of Ukraine are an integral part of Ukrainian society, and we never face Nazism here or fascism, and we feel safe in Ukraine, but we don't feel safe when Russia says there are Nazis here." So in other words, a person is saying, I'm Jewish, I live in Ukraine. I'm not afraid until I hear Russia talking about how there are Nazis here. This article goes on to talk about Ukrainian President Zelensky, who is Jewish. Quote, "You are told we are Nazis, but how can a people support Nazis that gave more than 8 million lives for the victory over Nazism? How can I be a Nazi?" he asked. "Tell my grandpa, who went through the whole war in the infantry of the Soviet army and died as a colonel in the independent Ukraine," he added. The article then interviews a rabbi in Ukraine who, quote, "I can only say that in terms of anti-Semitism, we're very secure here. Incidents are very rare and the government takes care of them. We're now in a war situation and hear sirens and see smoke from our house. So I don't want to get into the issue of anti-Semitism. It's not relevant. We're in a war and we're all coming together." But this is really the most interesting, opposed to anecdotal stories or quotes. An expert on the Ukrainian far right said Putin's rhetoric, quote, "shows how internalized his nonsense anti-fascist rhetoric is, and how being so steeped in self-serving World War II rhetoric has divorced him from reality. Right now, he's parroting the worst of Soviet-era propaganda about Ukrainians all being Nazis, each and every one," said Colburn, author of the upcoming From the Fires of War, Ukraine's Azov Movement and the Global Far Right. And doesn't that bring us back to the very beginning, where we had to lay out, yes, Ukraine is a country. Yes, Ukraine is a separate people. Yes, things happened in World War II. And that is how Russia and Putin spin propaganda to claim any idea of self-sovereignty aside from some pseudo-satellite state is a form of Nazism. Doesn't this just confirm all of that for us? The Azov Battalion does have ties to far-right political parties and neo-Nazi members. However, not all members are neo-Nazis, and those political groups, even with a united front, have not made a political impact in the national parliament or national government as a whole, for whom there currently is a Jewish president whose ancestors fought against Nazi occupation of Ukraine. The Azov Battalion is now part of the Ukrainian military. However, all volunteer forces were absorbed into the Ukrainian military structure beginning in 2014, when Russian-backed separatists attempted to secede. Numerous countries have funded Azov indirectly, as a battalion is part of the larger Ukrainian military. And so in essence, if you're funding the Ukrainian military, one could argue that a piece of that could be going to the Azov Battalion. US Democrats attempted to label the Azov Battalion a foreign terrorist organization and also attempted to block the group from receiving US funds. But overall, the Azov Battalion is a small piece to a much larger Ukrainian military apparatus. And within that small piece, some members are neo-Nazis. Without war breaking out with Russian-backed separatists and little green men, the group would most likely still consist of ultras and maybe paramilitaries at best. Russia benefits from the group's existence, at least in the propaganda realm, by tying them to Nazi collaborators in World War II. This builds a Russian narrative that there are Ukrainians with Russia, and then there are fascists. This excludes the possibility of there being non-fascist nationalist Ukrainians who simply want a sovereign Ukraine, who are the far majority of people in Ukraine. The arming and training of this group will lead to long-term questions for the Ukrainian government. This instability will also buoy Russian propaganda. The US and other aiding countries, as well as the EU, will also need to make hard decisions regarding the future of Ukrainian policy and the continued existence of these groups. At the moment of this video, all eyes are on Russia. However, these ideas will not simply disappear. Once this iteration of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict stalls, the organizations are still going to exist. There are also broader questions concerning US far-right extremists and their ties to the region, from the Renew America movement to the base. These are the serious considerations moving forward, and I would argue that we need to be focusing on them, not those of Russian propaganda or internet narratives.